capital city prices to rise in 2026 due to the government's 5% deposit guarantee and strong demand. I think slightly different forecast from what Louis Christopher had. Price gains forecast of 7% in Sydney, 6% in Melbourne, only 5% in Brisbane. Interesting that the report called out the government's deposit scheme, isn't it? Because Treasury said it wouldn't have so much of an impact.
You're taking the words out of my mouth here, Pete. That's exactly what I think the irony of this is. 1 to 2% increase in prices is, when they do these scenarios, they just sort of basically pluck these. It's not going to have much impact on the market. And then 3 months later, we're like, oh God, it's already gone up 3% in 3 months. And, we were warning about that all the way back to when the policy first got changed, back at the election time.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Pete Wargent from Alcove Mortgage Property Buyers. I'm here with Chris Bates from the Alcove Group Mortgage Specialist. G'day, Chris. How's your week been?
Going good, Pete. We're on the bit of a home stretch to Christmas right now. Obviously, a lot of clients who bought over spring are settling at the moment. It's usually quite a busy period of settlements this time of year, but also good buying. I think a lot of buyers are tired. Often they start not seeing a lot of new listings. They sort of potentially give their Saturdays up for other fun things to do in the silly season. And, vendors are often wanting to wrap it up so their property doesn't go stale over Christmas. So for the clients that, do be a bit persistent over the next few weeks, sometimes it's good buying. I'm not sure whether they're going to be this year. I mean, what have you seen over the years at this time of year, Pete, for your clients?
Well, I think it's mixed. There's definitely fewer listings at this time of year, especially I think in Queensland. A lot of people go away for the Christmas and New Year break. In Sydney and Melbourne, the auction market starts to wind down quite considerably from mid-December right the way through until Australia Day weekend. But yeah, you can sometimes sneak a bargain because there aren't so many people looking either. So what's going on here? Well, we've had some pretty epic storms in Brisbane and Sunshine Coast just last night. So a lot of people have their power down. There's trees down all over the place. Unfortunately, it's kind of storm season in Queensland, and we still have a lot of power that's it comes down pretty easily in the storms. The technology hasn't necessarily kept pace always, but we seem to be back on here anyway, touch wood. It's been cricket, of course, over the past week, but the less said about that, the better, I think. The Ashes is coming to Brisbane over the next week, so that'll keep me busy. Just a couple of anecdotes for you. Doing a couple of searches. It seems like in the commercial space, some of the yields are still pretty sharp when you actually find commercial investments with good tenants. So plenty of competition there. Also doing a couple of searches on the Sunshine Coast, and it's a bit mixed. I think when you're looking at the cheaper end of the market, there's sometimes properties that need a lot of work. There's plenty of those around in southeast Queensland and not so much buyer interest. But then when you get a home that's perfectly presented and staged for sale, we were looking at an entry-level property in Nambour at the weekend, and there was, I don't know exactly, but there was over 100 people there. It was absolutely wild. So I guess that says to me that the first home buyer money is certainly active out there looking, but maybe not that much tolerance for looking at sort of older style properties that need a lot of work. So a little bit mixed in the market there. Are you seeing anything similar in New South Wales?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of upgraders are sort of very tentative still. So I think some properties are probably going off like a frog in the sock and are just getting a lot of demand. And some properties, people are just like, interest rates are still going to potentially be high through 2026. And so I'm sure a lot of agents are just using the word patchy to sort of explain their experience. Sometimes properties are going nuts and others aren't. But the SQM sort of pain and gain report, the boom bust report that they release each year has just come out overnight. What was your thoughts on that, Pete?
Yeah, I've just got it open in front of me. So I guess if you looked at their base case scenarios, you'd probably say that momentum is the order of the day. So the biggest gains forecast for Perth at 12 to 16%. And also Brisbane 10 to 15%, and Darwin very similar numbers. So those are the markets where there's already been electric growth over recent years. Also pretty strong forecast for Adelaide, but far less strong for Sydney and Melbourne, at least on Louis Christopher's boom and bust numbers. So 4 to 7% forecast for Melbourne and 3 to 6% for Sydney. So I think as well, as always with the boom and bust report, they release a range of scenarios depending on what happens to the economy, what happens to monetary policy. But those are their base case forecasts. So definitely price increases. That follows what Domain have forecast, also, which we'll talk about a bit later on, and also most of the major banks. So it looks like some of that momentum in the housing market carrying over into 2026 because we haven't yet addressed the housing shortage.
I mean, these are big numbers. If I look at these numbers, what I like about Louis Christopher's report is he does different scenarios. Going back to my planning days, I mean, you used to have a lot of fund managers saying we expect this to happen and this is going to happen and China's and I didn't really like when sort of forecasters did that. I thought when they gave a bit more of a balanced view and said, well, it depends on, I guess as data comes along, and Louis Christopher's pretty good about that. He sort of says a base case of 25 to 50 basis point cut by the middle of next year, pretty sluggish economy. And, they do get inflation under control and, overall some big numbers. But the scenario 2 is if there's a bit more sticky inflation, maybe there's no rate cut till later in the year, inflation stays a bit higher, slower economy. Well, yeah, maybe the growth doesn't take off as much, but it's still, just due to a lack of listings, I reckon. I haven't read the full report yet because we haven't got it, but I reckon just because listings are so tight, even though that's not really a great scenario for the economy, higher, keeping rates high and inflation stays sticky, still some pretty significant growth, particularly in sort of Perth and Brisbane and Adelaide. And, I guess the next scenario he's got here is if there's a global spillover, and the economy, unemployment starts to really, ramp up. But in that situation, more significant rate cuts. He sort of said growth a little bit slower with this in some cities, but I don't know if there's a 1% rate cut, even though unemployment goes up, I reckon you'll find that, that'll put a lot of turbocharge behind prices, a similar COVID scenario, I reckon. And then he sort of talked about maybe there's a real strong economy rebound, inflation goes really low. And so I don't know. It's going to be interesting to read that report in detail. But no matter where you look at it, no matter all those scenarios, they're all big numbers. And if that ended up happening, I think that, people would be a bit shocked and the housing crisis would only get worse, I think, in this scenario because these are way higher than any wage inflation.
Yeah, I think it's the same problem all around the country, isn't it? We haven't really been building at any great speed, and there's lots of people coming back into the country on that sort of post-pandemic snapback. One of the articles we picked up this week, Sydney Morning Herald, Brits lead a surge in working holidaymaker visas. So, you only needed to look at the 20-odd thousand people in Perth for the cricket last week. Lots of people who haven't been able to travel for a while, I guess, due to the pandemic, and now they're sort of getting active again. And it looks like, here's a quote from the article: Australia is giving out a record number of short-term visas to backpackers, adding to the growth of temporary residents in the migration system. So, yeah, if you follow my monthly stats on my blog, you'll see that the number of temporary visas is shot up to a record high. We've dropped during COVID, and it's come absolutely firing back. There were 321,000 working holiday visas issued last financial year, up more than a third on the previous year. The UK makes up a quarter of all backpacker visas. So, I saw a little sort of documentary about a month or two ago interviewing a bunch of people from Ireland, and there was maybe, 13 people or something. I don't know exactly. And 12 of them said they were planning to leave, and the other one said, well, I'm not going to leave just yet because I've got to finish my studies. Then I'm going to leave. And I guess that's the thing in Australia at the moment. It's a popular destination. You only need to go down to Coogee, go down the beach there, and it's just all Irish voices. So there's a lot of backpackers around, or the Coogee Bay Hotel. So that's just one component of the visa system. Obviously, university students, the cap has been lifted for 2026. There's more temporary visas there. So yes, we do have a sort of a permanent migration cap, but there's lots of sort of other parts of the system, partner visas, working holidays, international students, just adding to the headcount. And of course, we're feeling that in the rental market and that just overall shortage of accommodation.
Yeah, and I think they've made some changes, right, Pete? The age has gone up, I think, from 30 to 35 and no farm work, etc. So, it's much more enticing to sort of come here on a working holiday. And then ideally, for some of them, they want to get permanent residency. Was that sort of a change we potentially shouldn't have done, Pete? What's your thoughts on that?
I think, yes, during the pandemic, of course, we didn't have the backpackers, the working holiday makers around. And you could see that was really hurting businesses like hospitality, cafes, restaurants, because a lot of those businesses are staffed by working holiday people. So I could see the thinking behind it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not actually 100% sure. Let's have a look at the article. So 88 days a year doing regional work. So it used to be back in our day that you could do a 12-month working holiday visa. You'd pick up your visa from Australia House in London. You had to sometimes go and collect them in person back in those days. But you could extend the visa for an extra 12 months if you did regional agricultural work or fruit picking or something like that. So, yeah, it looks like the maximum age was lifted in the Morrison era as part of a trade agreement, so with the UK. So, yeah, I mean, you can make the case both ways. I don't think it's a bad thing for Australia to have some temporary workers around. The unemployment rate's low, but some other countries like Canada have now seen their unemployment rate rising quite significantly, so that might change the settings a little bit. But yeah, I guess there's going to be quite a lot of interest paid to the demographic stats over the rest of the year because the permanent, the long-term arrivals and departures figures seem to suggest there's been a bit of a rebound in immigration. But of course, the net overseas migration figures are only reported with a big lag. So a lot of people eagerly waiting to see what happens with that. I think I saw on the Demog blog this week, a nice little blog spot there, the population of Victoria has quietly slipped past 7 million in the early parts of this year, something that didn't really get any coverage. Despite the sort of all of the challenges with the Victorian economy, all that state debt, all of the problems I had with lockdowns, the population growth has come absolutely firing back, and most of it now again driven by immigration. So, there was obviously a lot of disruption, but it hasn't really slowed things down all that much.
Yeah, I mean, another one of the articles we picked up on was the sort of building report issues. I think this is one thing we've seen over the years, and we're actually seeing this issue not just with houses, also apartments, and not just new apartments, older apartments. And so there was an article that basically highlighted when, just the amount of disclaimers and the conflicts in the building and pest industry with often real estate agents and platforms. And, I guess whenever you're buying a property, you are, putting often hundreds of thousands, if not millions into a property. And, it's very stressful. You're trying to find it. You miss out on an open home. You've got to act really fast. And, sometimes people make shortcuts that and there's a lot of pressure on them transacting fast, particularly in a market like Brisbane or with very low listings. And, the article basically highlighted when someone sort of has paid for a building and pest, it's sort of a lot of them have got massive disclaimers, they haven't gone to certain parts of the property. And, potentially there was conflicts in terms of, the real estate agent in here as well. And, they basically the property in this scenario had a lot of termites, and it doesn't mean to be always termites, could be lots of issues with the property. And, to actually get some money back and lodge a sort of claim and pay legal costs, A, it's time, B, it's money, and 3, you've also got to repair the property just because it could be getting worse. So, I think this is a bit of highlighted a pretty big issue, I would say, in the property market where, you've got to act fast, but then also you've got to do your due diligence as well. And, have you seen some massive issues over the years in sort of this space, Pete?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, if you use an independent contractor to do your building and pest reports, they're really good. And sometimes you really need to speak to the people doing them because they have to be risk averse and they have to put all the risks in the report. The article the Sydney Morning Herald wrote, so I'll just quote from the article: Tim bought his house almost sight unseen because he worked in a mine and he had trouble attending open homes. And obviously there was termites and the report was defective. But the first thing there is that if you're not going to see the property that you're buying, I mean, to be honest, you're asking for trouble. There's been a proliferation of this kind of thing in the real estate industry over recent years. It's always been there, but now it's really exploded in recent years, where people will set themselves up as a buyer's agent. Don't worry, we'll do all the research, we'll tell you what to buy. Then nobody's going to look at the bloody properties. I mean, what do you expect? Sometimes people will get somebody local to go and do an inspection for them. But yeah, I just think if you're not going to get somebody to inspect a property thoroughly, then you're going to get problems. In the part of the country where I live, there's a lot of post-war housing. Things like damp, termites, structural issues, stumping, roof issues. They're all significant risks and very expensive. So, yeah, if you can't get to a property personally to inspect it, get a buyer's agent to go through, get a building and pest inspector who you've contracted or you've engaged to go and look at it. Don't just rely on something that's provided by the vendor necessarily. And also have a bit of a contingency, because even with the best will in the world, you may well pick up repairs that need doing. But what you really want to avoid is those big structural super expensive issues, because they can be life-changing, and you might end up having to take out another mortgage just to pay for them. And also, if somebody's sort of saying, well, we'll help you buy a property, I'm based in, I don't know, I'm based on the coast somewhere, I'm going to help you buy a place in Melbourne, but I'm not going to go and look at it. Well, use some common sense, I guess. What else can I say?
Yeah, and I think the prefab industry is obviously getting a lot of heat behind it, which is good, right? We need lots of different solutions to the housing market. AFR did an article around sort of a new AI sort of startup called Bowman Group, which was interesting. But I think there's just been a lot of new companies in this space, and a lot of design, not just from a government level, but also build to rent and housing, etc. So I think that's going to be a big topic in 2026. More and more sort of prefab sort of innovation, I guess. You go look at countries, particularly in Scandinavia, the amount of housing that's produced, off-site and then brought onto site when it's ready to be installed is completely chalk and cheese. It's probably close to 80-90% of housing done that way over there versus maybe 10% here. So I think that's a trend that not only are the banks getting behind, the government's getting behind, and so I think we're going to see more and more of that.
Oh, I think so. If we're not going to go down the route of allowing cheaper labour into the country, then we could bring in cheaper workers from Asia, India, Bangladesh. But if we're going to rely on local wages with local qualifications, then construction costs are going to be high, and there's no way around that. Plus, we've got expensive land values anyway. If that's the case, then it does open the door, I guess, to prefab homes getting a bit of a boost. Particularly things like offshore precasting of concrete and assembly of homes off-site and things like that. So, I think it's definitely an interesting space, and some of the major lenders coming into the space as well, potentially, as the years go on. So that's sort of a big story that was released this week of a 60 billion investment going into that area. So, we'll track that as it goes into 2026. So let's go through our big three property news stories of the week. Stick around, because at the end we'll do your listener Q&A. We've got time for a couple of your questions as well. So every Sunday at 7 a.m, this is our 2 cent segment dropping into your podcast player, where we go through the big three property news stories in the media. So first story this week, 2 in 3 Brisbane homes sold without a price guide. An article in realestate.com.au. So I think that's not just a Brisbane thing, but they focused on Brisbane for this article. They were sort of saying this is one of the big Aussie scams, that people sell properties without a price listed. It's definitely a challenge if you're not familiar with how the market works. I think it's particularly true in Brisbane, because a lot of homes are listed with no price guide at all, and then you have to work it out for yourself. How do you know as a first home buyer or investor what the right value for the property is? There's no sort of shortcut. Market research is the only answer. I think in the past week, underquoting laws have also come into force in Victoria, so that'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think there's kind of an embedded assumption sometimes that if you introduce underquoting laws, that will automatically lead to better outcomes in the market in terms of prices and transparency. But I'm a bit skeptical. I think, yes, you might get a different price guide, but in the end, the market is what it is. It will be driven by fundamentals. So, sometimes that extra transparency might bring more confident bidding. You just don't know. So, early days for that new policy. But, what about in your neck of the woods, Chris? Do you get prices listed with properties, or do you often have to work it out for yourself?
Look, we sort of highlighted this last week on the pod, that there's some major changes going through, and they haven't been law in this, haven't been made law part of the They're going to go to Parliament next year in New South Wales, but fines are going up from 22 to over 100 grand, mandating price guides on all advertising, in New South Wales. A much better statement of information to help buyers. So there's some major changes happening in New South Wales. It's funny though, when you read through the New South Wales government, it's saying the proposed changes have been modelled on Victorian laws introduced in 2016, which have led to millions in fines and now widely accepted by the industry. And then you go to the New South Wales government website and then says, from November 25 of November, we're making massive changes, to the rules down there. And now there's got to be new legislation around sort of reserve prices. And so the Victorians are they're modelling on a law, 9 years ago. And now Victoria's already moved on and they're making major changes themselves. So to underquoting, because I think there's been a huge issue with that down there. So I think this is going to be obviously something we're going to have to track into next year, because it's going to be interesting how agents pivot to their processes to to the new laws and, how many fines actually go out. What's your take on this, Pete? I mean, you're more on the buying side. Obviously, there's a game that, buyers hate playing, but then sellers want it, basically are forced to play that game because that's the best way they can get a price on their house. So, yeah, it's one of those things that a lot of people are hypocritical when they're buying, but then they actually just still use the same techniques when they're selling.
Yeah, we don't really mind it in Queensland because I guess because we're in the market all the time, it doesn't really impact us. But I do sympathise with a first home buyer who's looking to buy their first place and they see a property listed. They think it might be something they could buy, and then they turn up and it turns out actually, they're 100 grand short of where they need to be. That can be frustrating, although I guess you learn pretty quickly. I'll just quote from the article here because there's no plans to actually change anything in Queensland as things stand. So 2/3 of Brisbane houses are hitting the market without a price guide, leaving home hunters blind when it comes to making one of the biggest decisions of their lives. As other states introduce harsh laws to crack down on underquoting and misleading advertising, 63% of 3 and 4 bedroom listings in Brisbane don't provide price indications, instead using generic terms like contact agent, for sale, submit offers. Even entry-level properties such as 1 bedroom units are now being offered to auction, leaving first-home buyers completely in the dark. I think that's interesting because Queensland is the only state where now properties can be taken to auction. You still don't have to provide any price guide at all. So, even in just the past week, I went to a couple of open homes and people are sort of saying, oh, well, come along to the auction. You never know. Even though I can clearly see that the property is above the budget price range I'm looking at, they try to get people to go along. And that can be quite time consuming and soul destroying for a first home buyer. If they think they're a possible buyer of a property, they register for an auction and then they just get outbid straight away. So, anyway. So REIQ CEO Antonia Mercarella said there are no plans to seek the repeal of the current laws in Queensland relating to auctions or price guides. So no changes up here. But, I think they've taken a bit more of a proactive approach in the sort of bigger capitals in the last few years, and more sort of regulation coming now in Melbourne as well.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of those things. Let's see how it plays out with legislation in 2026. A lot of it's, not going to be effective till then. So let's track that story next year, Pete.
Yeah, sounds good. So second story, Aussie home prices to shatter records in 2026. This is from Domain. Capital city prices to rise in 2026 due to the government's 5% deposit guarantee and strong demand. I think slightly different forecast from what Louis Christopher had. Price gains forecast of 7% in Sydney, 6% in Melbourne, only 5% in Brisbane. But for unit prices, Brisbane 7%, Perth and Adelaide about 5 to 6%. So affordability issues, I guess, starting to bite, and therefore people pivoting to units in those cities. Rents are forecast to rise 3%. And 4% in Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth. So, I guess this stuff is a bit of crystal balling at the end of the day, but I suppose it does sort of have an impact when I see the lead article today in the Australian Financial Review talking about potential 16% price rises in Perth. I don't think that it sort of hurts sentiment. We've seen the same on the other side when people are predicting price falls, like during the Banking Royal Commission. It can make buyers a bit more tentative. So it does have an impact on buyer psyche. So I guess just to quote finally from the article, the typical house across the country's combined capitals is forecast to rise 6% next year, hitting a record price of 1.3 million. So, yeah, pretty big numbers these days, isn't it, Chris? If you think about a median house for sale in a capital city, 1.3 million, that's probably maybe if you went back a dozen years, that's probably double what it was back then. Unit prices are tipped to rise 5%, jumping to a new median high of 759,000. Interesting that the report called out the government's deposit scheme, isn't it? Because Treasury said it wouldn't have so much of an impact.
You've taken the words out of my mouth here, Pete. That's exactly what I think the irony of this is. 1 to 2% increase in prices it's just a common. When they do these scenarios, they just sort of basically pluck these, it's not going to have much impact on the market. And then 3 months later, we're like, oh God, it's already gone up 3% in 3 months. And, we were warning about that all the way back to when the policy first got changed, back at the election time. And, I do think it's going to be, coming into next year, people will be just with the rental crisis and 5% deposit scheme there. And, investors are a funny lot. I think they're still going to be quite strong in the market next year. But, and you can see the AFR fast starters came out last week, which sort of highlights, some of the fastest growing companies in the country. And there was a number of sort of regional buyers agencies on there that with huge numbers for revenue. Absolutely. And, you only need to divide those numbers by, let's say, $20,000 per purchase, and you'll start to see, hang on a sec, how many properties are these people buying? And we're talking, if it's revenue sort of a 10, 20, even up to $30 million for some of these buyers agencies, you got to think about how many properties they're buying and where they're buying them all in certain markets, etc. And so I do think that was sort of like a piece of evidence just to prove that just how much they're buying. And I do think they're moving markets, particularly in regional locations. And when you've got one of the age-old problems with a buyer's agency, I don't think it's scalable industry. I think you get, A, it's hard to get good talent. B, it takes very good to get good at your jobs. And usually there's not enough good properties on the market to buy. And what ends up happening is buyer's agencies get competing briefs. If you're a home buyer in a capital city and you've got two briefs, circa, a lot of buyers are around certain same price points as well. So you could, you're running a buyer's agency and you've got a home buyer at, say, I don't know, $2 million. If another person comes on in your patch that says, I want to buy at $2 million, that's a conflict, because they could be competing on the same properties, and often buyer's agents have to turn it away. But when they have investors, they say, yeah, that's all right. We've got, 10 investors buying in this area all at the same price point. And those conflicts are just sort of forgotten about. And I think it's a real issue, I think, in the buyer's agency space with the sort of proliferation of investor focus going to, the next hotspot in terms of yield and pushing up prices and moving markets. And, there's some markets where, they've actually completely flooded the rental supply. There's regional markets in Victoria where, from my understanding is they've, just way too many rentals now. And, people, they just can't rent them out. And so they basically bought too many investments that just the local market can't handle. And there's just not enough rental demand. So, yeah, that would be my take on this going into next year, Pete, is absolutely there's likely to be growth, not just from the first home buyer deposit scheme, but also, a lot of people that are just, their lives are moving on right now. They just haven't upgraded and now they want to get, as rates are sort of stabilizing or potentially fallen a bit, they want to make it happen.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, I mean, just on the buyer's agency point, and I'm not talking my book here, I'm just talking about the industry as a whole. I'll give you an example. I'm currently doing 2 property searches, but that's taking up pretty much my entire weekend, looking at properties, trying to work out the best options for the clients. Now, yes, okay, I could maybe take on another search. I could maybe go to 3. But by its very nature, the quality of your service is going to drop. So the industry is scalable, but it's not easy to scale well with good quality. And yeah, I mean, you only need to look at some of those numbers. If somebody's buying 300, 400 properties in a year, you can do your own maths on the level of quality of the service. It's not going to be as high. People might, with all the will in the world, you can't buy as many properties at scale with the same level of due diligence and service. So, so you tread your own path on that one. Nicola Powell expects property price growth to moderate in the second half of 2026 as affordability pressures put handbrake on some gains. Shane Oliver at AMP originally thought 8 to 10% price growth in 2026. Now he thinks 8% as housing affordability starts to bite. Yeah, I think just to play devil's advocate for the Treasury, I haven't actually got their wording in front of me, but I assume what they were talking about would have been marginal increases in property prices driven solely by the 5% deposit guarantee, not the actual nominal increase next year. And I suppose as well, I think we touched on previously, the Housing Industry Association said you need to judge these policies over their full life and not just the first few months, because we could get more housing supply come online, for example, as a result of the additional buyers in the market, especially if they're buying new. So, it's not the Treasury's forecasts aren't quite as crazy as they sound. It's maybe just a marginal increase in prices, not just the nominal forecast that you get in the media this week. So let's look at our third story before your listener Q&A. Rental affordability worsens in regional Australia in 2025. So, that's interesting. This is from ABC News Business. There had been a thought that things might get a bit better as the pandemic rush subsided, but it hasn't really happened. Capital cities' rental affordability has levelled out a bit, although Brisbane and Perth are still worsening. SGS Economics and Planning looked at the numbers, and they look at low to medium income earners and the available rentals on the market. And it looks like across regional Australia, things haven't really picked up. If you go into some of those markets, it's true in the Sunshine Coast, also places like Geelong, Newcastle, those kind of markets. The demand has remained high, I suppose, for rentals. Now, the Housing Australia Future Fund is planning to deliver some affordable homes. That was announced for about the seventh time this week in the media, but that's been plagued by some delays and construction costs have skyrocketed. So, it's interesting to think ahead as to whether more people will continue to go regional. There's been obviously a big push from the major employers like the banks to get people back in the office 2 or 3 days a week. But it seems like rental affordability in the regions has actually got worse this year, if anything, rather than better. So, what's your take, Chris?
I mean, that goes counterintuitive to what I just sort of spoke about. I think that's where not all region markets are equal as well. I think particularly the sister cities to the capital cities, the Central Coast or Wollongong or the Geelongs, Victoria, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast. I'm sure that they're really struggling to basically have enough, as people leave the capital cities and they don't want to go too far away so they can still commute to the city. I think hybrid work, that story is going to continue, if not potentially more return to the office. I would say coming into 2026, that's another story we want to kind of watch. But I think hybrid work's kind of very embedded this year. I think up last year, maybe it was a little bit on the fence whether, people were going back to the office. I think this has been a year where people have been forced back to the office more and more. And I think that makes people wanting to stay close to the capital cities. The affordability benefit of going to the regions as well, right? Like if a lot of investors are pushing prices up, a lot of people are going, well, maybe I should just buy a house, or an apartment close to the city versus moving regional. So I can't rent. Prices have gone up a bit. Maybe that sort of real advantage of having no mortgage in the regions, that's just not there as much as well. And so, let's track this story as well next year, Pete, around sort of the return to work, because I think that's a big story that pushed the regions up in post-COVID, but maybe it won't continue on forever.
I think if you look at that, the stats there, things have calmed down a little bit. Certainly, the regions got extremely hectic during the race for space during the pandemic. That's not really going on at the same pace now, but the rental affordability hasn't really improved. And that's really 5 or 6 years now. Dubbo, Tamworth, Orange, cities like that, there's still a lot of demand for housing and we're just not building enough. So, it's definitely an ongoing trend to watch. So let's finish off with some of your listener questions. So first question from Mr. Monopoly Man. As a teacher, I continue to see an alarming lack of financial literacy in students and staff. Where would you recommend starting the process for schools to include financial literacy in the curriculum? Yeah, it's an interesting question. I spoke at the Storyfest event at Somerset College a few years back, and I was talking about financial literacy for kids. It's a tough gig when everyone else is doing exciting stories and things like that for the kids, and I'm talking about double entry bookkeeping or something. But it was a great bunch of kids, and also a lot of people are sort of talking about the ideas. But the challenge, of course, is that the curriculum is already full. The schools are judged on the grades that their students achieve, and there isn't really much time for extracurricular activities on top of the sports that everyone does in Queensland anyway. To do things like financial literacy. I suppose, there are certain things that would be good to filter into the curriculum. I suppose you could certainly include it in mathematics. They used to say, why don't kids learn to balance a checkbook or learn double entry bookkeeping as part of their maths class? But I think there's some basic financial literacy that wouldn't be too difficult to include in the curriculum. Things like avoiding credit cards and high interest debt, trying to avoid sports gambling, which is now so ubiquitous. And also just careers guidance is another thing. So I think we maybe had half a day of careers guidance at school, which is pretty wild when you think about all those years you're going to spend in the workforce and so little time spent considering what you're actually going to do with it. So there's definitely lots of bits and pieces. I did write a book some years ago about what to teach your kids about money because I was becoming a parent myself, and I did put a 20 bullet point summary at the front of that book because I knew that most people probably wouldn't read a longer book. So there's lots of sort of key stats. Also, don't forget Scott Paper's written very extensively on that subject. So I think that would be a good place if schools are looking to get some books in there, get some of Scott's material out to the educational facilities. But of course, it's so difficult because curriculums are already chock-a-block full.
Yeah, I was going to mention Scott, obviously his work, he's written the books on it. He's done a lot of volunteering within the schools, presenting. I do think, though, is it up to the school's responsibility? Is also up to the parents. I would say the next generation coming through are a bit more savvy and know they need to take ownership of everything from their super to, saving for a deposit for a house and, access to even just the Barefoot Investor as a book, that sold well over 1 million copies. So, I don't know. I think there's podcasts and, lots of ways that the next generation sort of is realizing that maybe they shouldn't make mistakes their parents made and left it too late to plan for retirement, and they're going to jump on the front foot. And maybe they're also saying, well, now I've also got to pass it on to the next generation. And so, I don't know. I guess I'm a bit more hopeful. I've seen, Netwealth have done things like Banker. If you look at, an app called Spriggy. I think he's got 1.3 million customers. So, that's parents who have basically opened up savings accounts for their kids and are teaching the kids, about money. And so, I don't know. I think I'm probably a little more hopeful, but I don't put it down to the schools. I'm putting it a bit more down to the parents as well. But I would say I've got a bit more faith that, the parents are actually taking an interest in this and are actually educating their kids on financial literacy. But I don't know, there'd probably be an argument to say that, everything's always the same. It's just, all about perspective, I guess.
Yeah, well, yes, you're right. I think if you can be more proactive, there's definitely lots more information, and it's far more accessible now with the advent of the internet, YouTube and Instagram and TikTok. There's info out there if you want to go and seek it.
Yeah, for sure.
Much harder in the textbooks back in the day, which were pretty dry. So second question, from Rentvest No More. So here it is. My wife and I are in our mid to late 30s. We're both working full-time with a 1-year-old and thinking of baby 2 soon. We're rentvesting with 5 investment properties valued at $5 million with $2 million of debt. We've got average salaries, live a modest lifestyle, and we're determined to create a better life for our kids than what we had. We're now wanting to stop renting, buy the family home, and redistribute our investments into ETFs that'll deliver long-term growth and cash flow without the constant maintenance calls and out-of-pocket expenses that properties deliver. So with our borrowing capacity maxed out, we can't see any other path out of rentvesting to buy the family home at a time when we need it. And hopefully we still meet our retirement goal by 50. So the dilemma is we face procrastinating options. So we sell some now and the rest later. We sell everything now and wait a bit longer and allow the properties to compound a bit further. And then what do we do with the cash? We're leaning towards selling 4 properties, buying the family home for 1.8 million with a minimal loan and mostly in cash. and then taking out an equity release to do a lump sum investment in ETFs, and then build the ETFs before topping up super as much as possible. So, gosh, there's a lot in there. Well, firstly, congrats on taking such a huge amount of action, which is difficult when you've got kids as well. That's an amazing effort. So I think, just in terms of the strategy from here, yes, I hear your point on maintenance and out-of-pocket expenses. Definitely a thing that happens with property. I suppose the risk, if you do everything all at once, there's a couple of things there. One is you get a lot of capital gains tax all falling in 1 year, which is annoying. But also there is a bit of a market timing risk thing there. If you do everything all at the same time, I mean, generally speaking in property, you want to try and buy when sentiment's reasonably low, and then you want to sell into a red hot market. So depending on where your properties are based, if you've got a portfolio, you might want to just try and sell the properties that are in a boom time part of the cycle. So for example, if you've got properties in Western Australia, 2026, 16% price growth forecast, well, that's the kind of market cycle to sell into. If you're trying to sell everything all at once, you probably won't get the timing quite so good. But Chris, what do you think in terms of when someone's got investment properties and they want to switch to potentially buying the family home, how do they think about that strategically?
Look, there's a lot going on in this question. You need to really probably sit down with a financial advisor and start to map out your life. Like you've mentioned some great points there, Pete, around sort of timing and tax. And, just because you want to make a shift, do you have to do it gradually? I do think this is a common challenge with sort of rent vesting. People get to it. Sounds like you got your 1-year-old, another baby on the way. All of a sudden you thought you could rent vest forever, and now you're like, oh, hang on a sec, maybe I don't want to do that with kids. Maybe I want community. Maybe I want school, stability and security, and just making sure I know where the kids are going to go to school. I want to really, basically build a, nice steady home for the next, 15, 20 years so they get through schooling. And so, I do think babies sort of change people's plans, and that's what we really try to do, is encourage clients to think that through before they go too deep down a rent vest. I was saying it hasn't worked, and a lot of people in this situation, it sounds like yourself as well, have done quite well, because you probably, that sounds like you maybe bought some good assets. But at the same time, if let's, I don't know where you're looking to own a home, you say sort of 1.8, maybe you are in Sydney, and so has the Sydney market also gone up quite a lot over that period? That yes, you made money on one hand, but have you spent, now have to pay much higher price for your house? And maybe you could have potentially bought a house many years ago, but you can't go back in time. And this is obviously just a challenge with your rent investing. Once you pay your capital gains tax, maybe your gains aren't as big as you thought. And, but yeah, I think it's just maybe making a shift and getting an asset that is going to give you that sort of family home. It's going to grow for you tax free. It's a really good asset. It's in a bit of a sanctuary. If you are in New South Wales, be really careful around all the changes that are happening with, the New South Wales government and rezonings. I think you've got to be really aware of that in 2025-6 versus you were potentially just a few years ago. And then depends on your borrowing capacity, but yeah, using equity in your home to then go and buy either back into the property market, back into shares. Obviously, maximizing your super's a really good idea. It depends on what your incomes are, and whether it's all just one income or it's high. You got one very high taxpayer, etc. But yeah, building equity. But don't be afraid of debt. Using debt now. I mean, you're in your late 30s. You do want to still be able to access leverage, but you've got 3 million of net equity here, maybe 2.5 after all your costs, and so making sure you buy a really good family home. Maybe don't try to get a bargain and try to keep it as low as possible. You might shoot yourself in the foot and miss the opportunity of getting one really good asset growing for you tax free. And then thinking through your life, like, are you actually going to retire at 50? A lot of people in this sort of FIRE mindset is that want to have work more optional, but that doesn't mean you're not going to earn any income. And so, you're really putting a lot of pressure on to hit this goal when it's maybe not the reality. If you are still going to earn an income, and maybe that you can also still live your life. So yeah, that would be my thoughts. It's just, and I agree with you, Pete, sometimes even if you make a decision, it's maybe the right thing to do is to sell some properties. Doesn't mean you just go and hit the button and sell them all. You might go, well, I want to maybe, sell that one now because I do see that prices are starting to level off, and, I do want to bank that money, and maybe I don't want to be, sentiment can shift quite quickly. It goes from a buyer's market to a seller's market or opposite. So, yeah, that would be my take on this. But you're in a good position, but often this is a situation where people have maybe gone down a rent vesting too much, and now they're like, hang on a sec, I want to shift into a home.
There's a couple of times when financial advice is really valuable. One is just before you retire and what to do with your super, but this might be another one. It's a major life pivot, and might pay to just map things out a little bit. So good stuff. Thanks, Chris. So come and join us at the Rask Community Forum. That's community.rask.com.au. Lots of chat and questions there, not just property. That's business, equities, and everything else in the investing world. Chris, what's on for this week for you?
Actually heading up to Newcastle. Spent some time with my mum and celebrated her birthday. We're actually doing some family photos, which is, one of those things that the family love. And we get good go down Merriweather Beach and see my mate who's having his first baby soon. So that's my weekend.
Beautiful. So, we've had some spare tickets for the GABA test coming up. It's a day-night test. So hopefully the weather holds. And, we've got some Aussie mates coming back from Singapore. So they're going to come along with us. And no doubt we'll be copping heaps as England go 2-0 down. So, but we live in hope. So thanks for joining, everyone. Send in your questions. There's links in the show notes on how to do that. And thanks, Chris. Look forward to seeing you next week.
We'll talk soon. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks for watching this episode of the podcast. If you want to hear more from us, you can get daily videos and podcasts on Rask's YouTube channel. Or if you want to enroll in a free course on investing, property, business, money, you name it, you can join over 34,000 other students and enroll in a free course on the Rask website. Simply head to www.rask.com.au and follow the prompts. Thanks for watching this Rask podcast.